There is a moment in certain prisons when time stops behaving like time. Days no longer lead anywhere. Years stop having meaning. And the future becomes something the brain quietly deletes to survive. This is not death row. There is no execution date. There is no parole hearing. There is no final chapter. This is life without parole. A sentence where the body lives, but the mind is forced to adapt to permanent hopelessness. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Life without parole, often called LWOP, is one of the most severe punishments used in modern justice systems. In the United States, over 55,000 people are currently serving life sentences, many with no possibility of release. In the UK, the equivalent is known as a whole life order. Across Europe, courts have repeatedly questioned whether a sentence with no chance of release violates basic human dignity. But statistics don't tell the real story. The real story unfolds slowly, inside the mind. Psychologists, criminologists, and correctional researchers have spent decades documenting what happens when a human being is told, officially and permanently, that nothing they do will ever change their fate. This documentary is about that psychological transformation, not sensationalized, not fictionalized, but grounded in verified research and real inmate behavior. The day hope is removed. The psychological damage of life without parole does not begin years later. It begins the day the sentence is understood. Clinical interviews conducted by the National Institute of Justice, NIJ, and prison psychologists show that many inmates do not fully process an LWOP sentence in court. The brain enters shock. Some report feeling strangely calm, not because they accept it, but because comprehension hasn't arrived yet. The reality settles in later, often alone, often at night. Former correctional clinicians within the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, describe a pattern. Inmates begin asking fewer questions. They stop requesting legal materials. They stop talking about appeals. This is not acceptance. This is psychological shutdown. Psychologist Dr. Craig Haney, whose work on long-term incarceration and isolation is cited internationally, explains that when the brain recognizes total lack of control, it often enters a state known as learned helplessness. This condition, first studied in controlled environments, becomes devastating when applied to real human lives. Inmates begin to internalize three beliefs. Nothing I do matters. The future is irrelevant. Emotional attachment is dangerous. Over time, behavior changes. Some inmates become hypercompliant. They follow every rule perfectly, not out of reform, but because decision-making itself feels pointless. Others do the opposite. Rule violations increase, not for gain, but to feel something. Correctional reports analyzed by the Chicago Crime Lab show that long-term lifers are statistically less impulsive, yet experience higher rates of depression, emotional flattening, and suicidal ideation than inmates with determinate sentences. One inmate, interviewed anonymously for a psychological assessment referenced in Haney's research, described it this way. At first, I counted years. Then I stopped counting. Then I stopped imagining myself anywhere else. This is the first mental fracture. The removal of hope does not cause constant suffering. It causes emptiness. And emptiness is harder to treat. Emotional numbing, when survival requires going blank. After hope disappears, the mind looks for another way to survive. Psychologists working in long-term facilities describe this phase not as breakdown, but as adaptation. According to research published through the American Psychological Association, APA, and long-term prison studies referenced by Haney and Irwin, inmates serving life without parole begin to reduce emotional range deliberately. Not consciously, neurologically. Strong emotions become liabilities. Grief reminds them of what they'll never regain. Anger risks disciplinary punishment. Joy creates contrast, and contrast creates pain. So the brain dulls everything. Correctional mental health staff report that many LWOP inmates stop reacting to news entirely. Family deaths, world events, Even personal health diagnoses are received with the same flat tone. This isn't strength. It's emotional anesthesia. Clinicians within CDCR note that long-term lifers often score lower on measures of emotional expression, yet higher on indicators of internal distress. The suffering doesn't disappear, it goes silent. Behaviorally, this looks like minimal facial expression, reduced speech, long periods of stillness, extreme routine dependence. Routines become anchors. Wake time, count time, meal time, yard time. Not because they are enjoyable, but because predictability replaces meaning. One former prison psychologist described it as living inside a calendar instead of a life. In interviews summarized in Irwin's prison sociology work, inmates serving LWOP often say they feel less like people and more like functions. A body that eats. A body that sleeps. A body that waits. This is where identity begins to erode. When the future is erased, the self slowly follows. And once identity weakens, something else moves in to take its place. Identity collapse, when the self stops existing. Identity depends on movement. Who we believe we are is shaped by where we've been and where we believe we're going. Life Without Parole destroys the second half of that equation. Criminologist John Irwin, whose work with long-term prisoners remains foundational, observed that inmates serving irreversible sentences often experience what he called institutional self-replacement. The personal identity, parent, worker, partner, citizen, slowly fades. In its place forms a prison-constructed identity designed only for survival. Researchers supported by the NIJ found that many LWOP inmates stop using their own names internally. They begin to think of themselves by number, housing unit, or function. This isn't symbolism. It's cognitive adaptation. When the future self disappears, the mind compresses identity into the present moment only. There is no later me, only current me. Correctional officers often describe certain lifers as ghosts. Not because they cause trouble, but because they seem psychologically absent. Always present, rarely engaged. In one nonfiction psychological case referenced in Haney's interviews, an inmate serving LWOP described his mental state after 18 years. I don't imagine myself older. I don't imagine myself younger. I don't imagine myself at all. This is not depression in the traditional sense. It's existential erasure. Studies from the APA indicate that identity loss correlates strongly with dissociation, memory degradation, reduced self-reflection, emotional detachment from one's own body. Some inmates begin speaking in the third person when describing themselves. Others stop speaking about themselves entirely. From the outside, they appear calm. Inside, the self is quietly dissolving. But identity collapse doesn't always result in emptiness. Sometimes, it creates something darker. Psychological fracture, when meaning is replaced. When identity collapses, the human mind does not remain empty for long. It fills the void with structure, belief, or control, anything that restores a sense of order in a world with no future. According to long-term behavioral analyses cited by the NIJ and correctional mental health evaluations within CDCR, inmates serving life without parole tend to fall into distinct psychological survival paths. Some pursue total control. They memorize rules. They monitor routines obsessively. They react intensely to minor disruptions. Control becomes meaning. These individuals are often misunderstood as difficult or rigid, but psychologists recognize this behavior as a response to absolute powerlessness. When nothing can change your sentence, controlling the smallest details becomes psychologically vital. Others pursue belief systems. Religion, philosophy, or rigid personal codes provide an external framework to replace the lost future. Research summarized in Irwin's prison sociology shows that belief adoption among LWOP inmates is less about faith and more about narrative survival. Belief offers a story when life no longer has one. A third group fractures inward. Psychological assessments referenced by Haney describe increased rates of paranoia, derealization, feeling the world isn't real, internal dialogue replacing external communication. These inmates are not psychotic in the clinical sense. They are adapting to permanent isolation from possibility. One long-term lifer interviewed for a correctional mental health review explained, "If I don't make my own rules, I disappear. If I don't believe something, I collapse." This fracture is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, gradual, and often invisible to anyone outside the cell. But there is one moment that forces every LWOP inmate to confront the sentence again. A moment that resets the psychological wound. Aging inside a permanent sentence. Life without parole changes meaning as the body ages. In early years, survival is mental. Later, it becomes physical. Research compiled by the NIJ and healthcare reports from long-term correctional systems show that LWOP inmates experience accelerated aging. Chronic stress, limited movement, poor sleep, and constant vigilance place the nervous system in a permanent state of strain. By middle age, many lifers show health profiles closer to people 10 to 15 years older in the general population. Arthritis, cardiovascular disease, vision loss, and chronic pain become common. But the psychological impact is deeper. According to prison mental health evaluations referenced by the APA, aging reintroduces something LWOP inmates worked hard to eliminate. Fear. Not fear of release. Fear of dying inside. Medical visits become reminders that the sentence will outlast the body. Unlike inmates with parole eligibility, there is no hope of getting out before it gets worse. One nonfiction case summarized in CDC or geriatric inmate reports described an older lifer who began refusing medical care. Not out of denial, but because treatment extended a life he no longer associated with meaning. Others react oppositely, becoming hyper-focused on health routines. Walking the yard endlessly. Counting steps. Monitoring blood pressure. This is not vanity. It is the last form of control available. As peers begin to die, the prison becomes a place of continuous disappearance. Cells are reassigned. Names vanish from count sheets. Conversations end mid-sentence, permanently. Owen noted that older lifers often stop forming friendships entirely. Attachment creates grief. Grief has no resolution. At this stage, one question becomes unavoidable. What does punishment mean when change is no longer possible? This question does not only affect inmates. It reaches beyond the cell. The silent weight on the system. Life without parole does not affect only the person sentenced. It reshapes the psychology of everyone around them. Correctional officers, medical staff, and mental health clinicians working with LWOP populations are exposed to a unique form of moral strain. Unlike temporary custody, this is permanent human containment. Studies cited by the NIJ and occupational mental health research referenced by the APA show higher levels of emotional distancing among staff assigned long-term lifer units. This distancing is not cruelty, it is protection. When the brain recognizes that a person will never leave, empathy becomes difficult to sustain. Officers report learning not to ask about family, not to discuss the outside world, not to acknowledge milestones. These are not policies. They are coping strategies. Mental health professionals describe a condition similar to moral injury, the psychological stress that occurs when one participates in systems that conflict with personal ethics. One clinician, quoted anonymously in a correctional psychology review, stated, "You can help symptoms, but you can't help the situation. That's the part that stays with you." Even routine interactions change. Conversations become procedural. Relationships become strictly functional. Over time, this emotional flattening spreads. Institutional culture adapts to permanence. According to sociological analysis by Irwin, prisons holding large LWOP populations develop different behavioral norms. Time slows. Innovation decreases. The system itself becomes oriented toward maintenance, not transformation. This creates a feedback loop. Inmates lose hope. Staff emotionally withdraw. The environment becomes psychologically inert. But pressure builds. And eventually, societies are forced to ask whether irreversible punishment aligns with evolving standards of justice. The silent weight on the system. Life without parole does not affect only the person sentenced. It reshapes the psychology of everyone around them. Correctional officers, medical staff, and mental health clinicians working with LWOP populations are exposed to a unique form of moral strain. Unlike temporary custody, this is permanent human containment. Studies cited by the NIJ and occupational mental health research referenced by the APA show higher levels of emotional distancing among staff assigned long-term lifer units. This distancing is not cruelty, it is protection. When the brain recognizes that a person will never leave, empathy becomes difficult to sustain. Officers report learning not to ask about family, not to discuss the outside world, not to acknowledge milestones. These are not policies. They are coping strategies. Mental health professionals describe a condition similar to moral injury, the psychological stress that occurs when one participates in systems that conflict with personal ethics. One clinician, quoted anonymously in a correctional psychology review, stated, "You can help symptoms, but you can't help the situation. That's the part that stays with you." Even routine interactions change. Conversations become procedural. Relationships become strictly functional. Over time, this emotional flattening spreads. Institutional culture adapts to permanence. According to sociological analysis by Irwin, prisons holding large LWOP populations develop different behavioral norms. Time slows. Innovation decreases. The system itself becomes oriented toward maintenance, not transformation. This creates a feedback loop. Inmates lose hope. Staff emotionally withdraw. The environment becomes psychologically inert. But pressure builds. And eventually, societies are forced to ask whether irreversible punishment aligns with evolving standards of justice. When the world pushes back, review dignity and the mind. Across the world, life without parole has become more than a punishment. It has become a psychological question. In Europe, courts have increasingly focused not on whether people should be punished, but whether punishment without any possibility of review destroys the human capacity for moral change. Legal analysis referenced by international justice researchers and summarized in work cited by the APA shows that the issue is not release itself, but recognition of psychological continuity, the idea that a person decades later is not the same person who committed the crime. From a psychological perspective, this matters deeply. Studies discussed by Haney indicate that the mere existence of a future review, even 1 decade away, alters inmate behavior. Emotional engagement increases. Long-term thinking returns. Identity stabilizes. Hope, when reintroduced, does not erase harm, but it restructures the mind. In contrast, inmates serving irreducible sentences show what researchers describe as temporal collapse, an inability to mentally project forward. Without projection, moral reasoning weakens. Responsibility becomes static instead of developmental. This is why psychologists emphasize that review is not mercy. It is cognitive oxygen. In the United States, however, LWOP remains widespread. Research from the Chicago Crime Lab shows extreme sentencing disparities across states, often unrelated to rehabilitation outcomes or long-term public safety risk. From a psychological standpoint, the absence of review does not produce better behavior. It produces resignation. And resignation is not reform. The system gains stillness, but loses transformation. Which leads to the final question. What is the purpose of a mind that can never change? Punishment is meant to serve a purpose. Deterrence. Protection. Accountability. But psychology asks a different question. What happens when punishment eliminates the possibility of becoming someone else? Life without parole freezes a human being in the worst moment of their life, not legally, but psychologically. Research from the NIJ, APA, CDCR, Haney, Irwin, and the Chicago Crime Lab all point to the same conclusion from different angles. Permanent hopelessness does not produce growth. It produces adaptation without meaning. The inmates in this documentary are not symbols. They are outcomes. Outcomes of a system that decided some futures no longer matter. This is not an argument for release. It is an argument for recognition that the human mind is not designed to live without time, possibility, or change. And when those are removed, something fundamental breaks. If you believe documentaries should go deeper than headlines, if you believe psychology matters in justice, and if you want to understand systems, not just stories, subscribe. Because the most dangerous prisons are not just made of steel.